All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Welcome to this very, very interesting talk. A couple of things. Thing number one, I'm sure that you found some source of nourishment here on the side. Please feel free throughout the talk to go and help yourselves. And this is, thank the Strauss Center very much for hosting Dr. Jana Robinson and this talk. The other thing is that I'm going to leave it up to Jana to decide, but I think certainly she feels comfortable with getting people engaged and less of this kind of, the lecture and dictatorial kind of thing, and more of trying to get folks into the audience engaged. So I'm going to leave that to her. So even though this seems kind of formal, I'm going to let her become as informal as she'd like. And then I'd like to also say that I feel very, very honored to be leading the space security and safety program within Strauss. I've had a couple of formidable Brumley fellows, Daniel Michon, the first one, he's present, he's sitting there, and he's been a force majeure in helping get this stuff going. And now we have Sarah Probst, who's been really awesome, and her real interest has been, in intellectual property, these sorts of things. In a moment of weakness, she's been considering, issues of space sustainability and security. And she's a second-year law student and a Brumley fellow. And so I'm going to let her make the next introduction. And thank you very much.
All right. So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to hear about this talk, and I have the honor of introducing our distinguished speaker this afternoon, after 12. So Dr. Jana Robinson is currently the Space Security Program Director at the Prague Security Studies Institute, or PSSI, it's up there. She previously served as the Space Policy Officer at the European External Action Service in Brussels, as well as a Space Security Advisor to the Foreign Ministry of the Czech Republic. From 2009 to 2013, Dr. Robinson worked as a resident fellow at the European Space Policy Institute, and seconded from the European Space Agency, leading the Institute's Space Security Research Program. Dr. Robinson is, there's a lot of accolades here, an elected member of the International Institute of Space Law and the International Academy of Astronautics. She is also a member of the advisory board of the George C. Marshall Missile Defense Project of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. Robertson holds a PhD from the Charles University's Faculty of Social Science, Institute of Political Studies in the field of space security. She also holds 2 master's degrees from George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. So please give another round of applause and welcome Dr. Jana Robinson.
Thank you for the very warm welcome here and introduction. I do not like to stand behind the desk, but just because I will want to move the slides, I'll move behind the desk from time to time. But I would just very briefly talk about what I am doing right now and where I come from, to put that lecture into a context of what I am doing on a day-to-day basis. So the Prague Security Studies Institute is a non-profit, non-governmental organization, a small think tank, if you will, that deals with security policy. We were founded in 2002 in Prague by the former National Security Advisor to President Václav Havel and former Senior Director for International Economic Affairs at the Reagan White House. So it's a transatlantic organization, if you will. We were founded to start spreading educational and other activities that relate to security policy and international and security aspects of international relations and affairs in the post-communist countries. And our goal is also to continue to strengthen transatlantic relations, but we also deal with international issues in very select areas, and space is one of them. And so part of that research and policy work that I am doing and with my team and with my other colleagues is in this area, and that's where also our research and the findings that some of that I will talk about today. By the way, can you hear me well in the back? I just want to make sure. Okay, well, perfect. So I will start, well, first also, I would like to thank again to the Strauss Center for having me, and to Dr. Marie Bajak, and I would like to thank Lindsay Staniek, she's not here, but for all the wonderful logistic support that she provided to me. I will start with a brief introduction, a few slides. I might skip some of the content that I prepared just because I want to maybe get into the interactive Q&A part where we might want to maybe discuss things that are of interest to you or that may come up to you and you might want to ask as I talk. So as you probably know by now, space security is a large portfolio, and I definitely would need more than 1 hour to cover all the aspects of space security. So that's why today I will focus on a particular segment of space security, and that is deliberate, or if you will, active threats, keeping in mind that there are other natural hazards and threats that present serious challenge to space safety and security, such as the dangers of space debris, or the growing demand for the limited radio frequency spectrum and orbital slots, as well as new technologies and concepts that are entering the space domain. What I'd like to do is approach this presentation from the perspective of strategic studies and focus mainly on the space state actor threats. And that's why I will also talk about hybrid operations and how they relate to space security and sustainability. One of the areas I'd like to talk about is the economic and financial dimensions of space security, which is rather a new subject that we believe will, however, become prominent in the fairly near term, especially as our private companies begin to seek global markets for their equipment and services. And finally, I'd like to make some, I think, observations about how do we strike a balance between the benefits of enhanced cooperation globally on security issues and security imperatives in space, so which is always a difficult task. As I mentioned in my written description of this lecture, we cannot extrapolate space security in 21st century as something that we know from our Cold War experience. First, we've got the number of public and private actors involved in space activities worldwide has increased dramatically. We have the number that you often hear is over 70 government and non-government entities operating in space, and this number is increasing basically on a monthly basis. This has been accompanied by an increasing number of countries that are dependent on space capabilities and services. That has not been the case in the past. And secondly, the geopolitical environment has deteriorated significantly over the past several years. Although almost space actors, no matter of the level of their capabilities, can influence safety and long-term sustainability of the space environment, it is the major actors, that is the United States, Russia, and China, which will determine the viability of operating in space, at least in the foreseeable future. As these three actors, however, do not share a common assessment of the threat environment, it will be essential to determine how these relationships between these countries and interaction will impact on the stability of that environment. I think that it's fair to say the global counterspace dynamic, that is the capabilities that could be used to deny, disrupt, destroy, or degrade space system, is primarily driven by the terrestrial rivalries between these three actors. And many other countries observing this dynamic also strive to equip themselves with improved space capabilities to support their national security objectives. So, in short, the the ability of nations to leverage space for defensive and potentially offensive purposes is fast improving. I think that part of that issue is that we have had a limited awareness of what is happening in space, and that's why we have witnessed a growing stature of space situational awareness as an indispensable component of space security. And as space provides support to terrestrial military operation, information, and command and control of forces, today's geopolitical tensions create the potential for miscalculation and conflict that will impact the space domain. Destructive anti-satellite capabilities such as ground-based or co-orbital ASAC capabilities, high-power microwaves, or high-power lasers feature prominently as a concern due to their offensive nature. But not all threats, of course, originate in space, and beyond the growing vulnerabilities of satellites, there are major risks to the ground systems and links, or communication links. In the United States, but also in other countries, in Europe, Japan, and other countries, the counterspace activities of China and Russia have been of great concern. This includes anti-satellite weapon developments and testing, as well as reversible measures that are represented by various forms of interference that I will discuss down the road. So in January 2019, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the US Air Force released reports that assess the increasingly contested domain. And there are also now annual reports of nonprofit organizations such as the Secure World Foundation or Center for Strategic International Studies that recount a number of concrete examples of this counterspace dynamic. So I do encourage you to find these if you're interested in these topics, and they're available online. For example, even NATO stated that the alliance countries are recognizing that their prize dominance in space, how they call it, where they still account for well over half of the satellites, also create vulnerabilities. NATO is to declare space as operational domain in December of this year. And for example, even the European Union has created a new Directorate General for defense industry and space. So these are all new, very recent developments. Our institute, focused last year in a report which we call Europe's Preparedness to Respond to Space Hybrid Aggression on the gray zone spectrum of space threat, which we defined the space hybrid operation as intentional, often harmful space actions or activities that are specifically designed to exploit the links to other domains and conducted just below the threshold of requiring meaningful military or political retaliatory responses. I think this gray zone is an environment that permits achieving some kind of objectives without triggering any unwanted military or political responses, and I think that's the most important part of it. And there's also the asymmetry of vulnerabilities and effects that impact virtually all space actors, even would-be adversaries. And there are no accepted deterrence regimes currently in place to address these kind of lower level activities. And this is definitely a major issue. I mean, in this, I list some of these in the table. Is in this report we offered a list of more well understood threats such as jamming or spoofing, cyber attacks, rendezvous and proximity operations, or directed energy operations. And we also introduced the issue of the economic and financial predations, which I will talk about a little later. But let's face it, space hybrid operations, they're not a new phenomenon. But what is, I think, more important today is that it's not only military assets, but also civilian and commercial ones that are at risk of being disrupted. And perhaps that's the reason why this issue is increasingly brought into the open source, into the discussions. I think counter space activities, a lot of you probably have read about them or studied about them, via the cyber domain represent a prime example of how to secure an asymmetric advantage without paying a serious price. As the space and cyber domains are linked operationally, cyber-related vulnerabilities of space assets are a major concern for national security. The establishment of effective defensive posture to secure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of space infrastructure has really been a challenge. In the United States, for example, recently, that is in September of last year, space cybersecurity was added to the National Cyber Strategy, and in a way of implementation, an interagency space cybersecurity working group was formed to improve handling of cybersecurity risks to space systems. And accompanying to that, a Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is an industry group, is to help inform the private sector. And the board members of this group met in November for the first time. I think that the threat posed by state actors is potentially quite troubling, because that could have strategic consequences, and not only, and that includes economic and social. And I think this is not well understood today by decision makers, and that's why I think a struggle to really push for a more comprehensive approach to this. I could recite a number of examples. I have listed some of them in my written remarks here, but for example, these are all, of course, from open source. In 2007 and 2008, command and control systems of the U.S. Landsat 7 satellite systems was attacked, or the Terra Earth observation system back in 2008. In the 2015 congressional report, they referred to a number of hackers by China, for example, against the U.S. space assets, including a September 2014 attacks against NOAA satellite and weather service systems. I think a well-known example that has been used a lot of cyber espionage using space assets was undertaken by the Russian-led Turla group, which hacked into satellites to get access to sensitive and confidential information of Western embassies and government institutions, as well as military entities between 2008 and 2016. The attacks implicated 42 countries, including the United States and 6 European countries. More recently, in 2017, Symantec caught a China-affiliated hacker group called Thrip that had attacked 2 satellite companies, a U.S. Defense Department contractor and a geospatial imaging firm. The Chinese hackers seemed intent on specifically gaining access to operational technology that is used to physically control satellite systems. And this group has reappeared after 2 years of dormancy after the US President Obama and the Chinese President Xi had an agreement that resulted in the cessation of Thrip activities. Just this Friday, I read in the Financial Times, which reported that North Korea is suspected to have hacked into the Indian Space Research Organization during the time that it conducted its Chandrayaan-2 moon mission, as well as other systems, not related to that, in September. And that mission, as you know, probably know, ended in failure. But of course, more circumstantial evidence or other details were not available in that particular article. So what I'm trying to say by all these examples is that I think it's only a matter of time when a political crisis will probably ensue from a more serious incident. And this is still yet to happen. So I think another problematic area that I'm listing here is radio frequency interference, and that means both intentional and non-intentional. The international coordination and registration processes of the International Telecommunications Union are required to ensure interference-free use of radio frequencies and orbits. So the main purpose of the ITU's international regulatory body or the regulatory regime for satellite communications is to avoid harmful interference and to ensure equitable access to radio frequencies and satellite orbital slots. But despite this international ITU regime, harmful interference is a rapidly growing problem. Deliberate disruption of radio and TV broadcasts through frequency jamming and intentionally caused interference in order to deny access to information is on the rise in several parts of the world. The problem, again, is that unequivocal attribution is often difficult, and I think that existing tools to neutralize such interference is quite limited or non-existent. I can also use the example on a government level where Russia has created jammed the GPS systems just prior to entering Crimea, invading Crimea in 2014, or more recently there are cases where in 2018 Norway and Finland have publicly voiced concerns and said that they have approved that Russia hacked into their communication systems or jammed their communication systems during their NATO exercises in the Northern Sea. So this is also a real problem, and there are not a lot of policy responses available to such issues. Other things that I'm mentioning here is, for example, proximity operations. In a way of examples, we have the well-known example of the Russian Lukh-Olim satellite, which since 2014 has made a number of maneuvers, including close to the US private operator Intelsat, as well as a French military satellites that was voiced as a concern by the French defense minister recently. I think a last maneuver that we witnessed was a month or two ago. So that satellite is still seemingly active, and we've got other examples from other countries like the Chinese Shirian 7 and other examples. So again, the problem with these actions that they could seem seemingly isolated, but they could trigger some form of cascading effect that could affect all space actors, even those that are not involved in those particular operations. So I think that today we still don't adequately understand how this could play out, and I don't think it's also well understood by the would-be perpetrators always, because we don't have enough precedents to understand the secondary and tertiary effects of those actions. And again, I think that when we think about policy adjustments, we have to understand what kind of deterrence options we have to deal with such contingencies, because I think we want to definitely prevent and preempt some of these activities rather than react after they have already happened. So this is something that I think is quite new in the discussions on space security. This is something that our institute is currently working on. It's an initiative to look into a version of a hybrid operations that is not traditional in its form. And that's, we were trying to, in the 2018, when we were trying to list all the variety of these gray zone or hybrid operations, if you will, we came to recognize that the economic and financial space activities represent, of some actors represent, I think, quite a prominent threat, if you will, that could even reach the level of cyber, but perhaps not with such an immediate effect. So we focused, when we looked at our research, we looked at China and Russia because they're the only countries globally beyond that have a global economic and financial space footprint. So I think many of you are following the broader economic and financial activities of these two actors. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative of 2013, or the Made in China 2025, or Russia's diplomatic outreach to its old Soviet allies in Africa. I mean, those are just a few examples. So again, we think that as with cyber, there is a asymmetry of effects and vulnerabilities. It's, I think today there has not been anyone who reviewed the vulnerabilities that stem from the economic and financial predations. We approach this issue transactionally and empirically, so we basically tracked and visually mapped Chinese and Russian space activities globally, and in that we have been trying to test it against the concept that we developed and that we call space sector capture. So what is this concept about? So we defined it as a state actors' provision of space-related equipment, technology, services, and financing, ultimately designed to limit the freedom of action and independence of the recipient state's space sector, generally implemented on an incremental basis. So this is a little bit of a long kind of term, but the idea is to see to what extent countries that do certain transactions to improve their presence in space or are entering the space sector, to what extent are they able to preserve their national sovereignty and commercial competitiveness after they receive such assistance. So we concluded in this report, and there's an executive summary that's available for you to read if you're interested. We concluded that some of these partnerships, if you will, exposes the recipient countries to the vulnerability of unequal and unsustainable space partnership is just because, in effect, their space sectors are being captured by vertically integrated control of the space, individual space segments. And that's the phenomena that we were talking about. So, for example, the targeted country receives one or more satellites, launch services, the construction of ground stations, the provision of operating personnel, 100% subsidized financing, and other services such as GNSS from the GNSS systems. The net effect of which is to basically create a sole source supplier relationship and then basically a perilous level of dependency. So in our analysis, we have been trying to look at the character of these countries, that is developed versus developing countries, and we try to dissect the various transactions of China and Russia in these countries, and they delineate potential strategic and downside commercial risk associated with this. And we did determine that there's actually a material risk of these countries associated with accepting some of that assistance. So we analyzed, in this report particularly, we analyzed 216 transactions in 88 countries. And I think that what we concluded is that there is also something that we noticed, and that is vertically integrated end-to-end package deals that are actually a hallmark of Chinese and to a lesser extent Russian influence attempts. And frankly, if you look at that, that's pretty it's a pretty different approach from what a European or an American or any other company would do in international markets. So, you know, in Africa, for example, you have a country like Nigeria that is still repaying its loan for Nicomsat, which is their it's a government telecommunications provider. And interestingly, you know, the country buys services for more other traditional telecom providers. So you have to always, you know, trying to assess why then has there been such a large need for a government provider when the government at the end is not using its own company to gain those services. If we stay in the telecommunications sector, you know, complete packages have been delivered by China, for example, to Venezuela, Chile, Cuba, or Brazil. And you know, Bolivia, for example, is an interesting case study, as it signed a cooperation agreement under the Belt and Road Initiative, whereby China agreed to construct and finance its transport and telecommunications infrastructure. And of course, the country, as in a number of other cases, is a recipient of loans from the China's Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank, which, as you know, are the Chinese government's tools of funding its international projects. So I think that, you know, we can always speculate what are the reasons of such large loan on the part of the Chinese. But of course, for example, Bolivia possesses the world's largest and more accessible reserves of lithium, for example. So we can only speculate. In Southeast Asia, you know, China, I think you have probably heard of projects with Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or the Maldives, and some, I think 5 years ago, Pakistan, for example, decided to opt out of India's South Asia satellite project in favor of collaboration with China, which was, I think, a setback for India's diplomatic initiative to bring regional partners into this program. Well, partially that could have been influenced by China's 60 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor package, which, however, has made Pakistan the biggest debtor nation to China is in Southeast Asia. And indeed, I think in a need of a couple of IMF bailouts today. So again, this is besides Pakistan, I think Sri Lanka also faces risks that are related to debt unsustainability from China. So these are, you know, just a few examples of that. So just to conclude the part on the ENF, I think that what we're facing here, and we think it's a problem, are these long-term dependencies of countries on Chinese assistance. Because, you know, the reason why a lot of countries are entering the space market or space sector, if you will, is to create a better strategic position for themselves. But it's not clear whether such, you know, whether this is a good path forward for these countries. And, you know, they're often welcomed. You know, this support is often welcome because they lack space funding, they lack technical expertise, and they lack human resources to do it. So I think they take the deal despite the fact that it exposes them to these outside benefactors. So I think what we think from our perspective, that means, you know, the European countries and the United States and our other partners, I think we need to understand better this global situation in the economic and financial domain, and to understand actually the scale of these activities, because I don't think we have a clear understanding today about the implications. And, you know, sometimes the incremental approach that is being applied, that is, you know, setting up various educational, scientific, or purely commercial constructs, and then when they're developed into something else, they're harder to actually pinpoint or even protect against. But as in other hybrid, I think, activities, I think that's the goal, to actually zoom in on the details to understand them better. So, we can actually think, if I want to play a devil's advocate here, can we think about some of these activities and compare them, for example, to the case of the South China Sea under the Obama administrations? Because at that time, they were just uninhabited stretches of rock and sand. But later they were transformed into illegal island fortresses that are there today. You've got barracks, you've got airfields, you've got air defense systems, you've got ports capable of accommodating large naval vessels, and SIGINT facilities. So this is quite a large transformation. So can we think about these space transactions in these terms? And what is a more worrisome trend is also that we are witnessing competing models of space partnerships, what we call authoritarian versus democratic model of space partnerships. And I think that the space countries themselves have to be really careful about not to mortgaging their futures to any other outside benefactors that puts them in compromising situations. So also, I think that understanding these economic and financial operations will also help us understand the asymmetric threats to global norms and standards, because this is something that we're actually trying to discuss today. What will be the future norms and standards globally? Are those that we have today, will they be preserved, or will there be others that will maybe not be in line of something that is desirable for us? So, given all of the above, where are we with regard to space governance? I think there are 3 initiatives that are relevant to the discussions concerning China's and Russia's power projection. The so-called Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space, or PARIS, a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space and the threat or use of force in outer space against outer space objects, or so-called PPWT, and so-called no first placement of weapons in outer space initiative. So these are basically arms control proposals, if you will, that have been promoted by Russia and China. The PPWT draft was first presented in February 2008. There was a revised version from that was put forward in June 2014. But first, it was promoted back in 2001 by a Russian working paper, and by 2002 by a joint paper by Russia and China. And this is all happening in the context of Conference of Disarmament. Well, I mean, the problem with this instrument is that it is perceived by the United States, but also a number of other countries, as flawed in many respects. So, for example, the PPWT has not addressed ground-based counter-space weapons, including the research and development and production. And that is, of course, besides the kinetic anti-satellite weapons, for example, weapons such as lasers, which have been used in the past. So also, I think that the lawyers out here, we can ask the questions of, what is the threat of force? How do you define it for the purposes? Is, for example, possessing an ASAT capability, is that a threat of force? Is a threat to destroy one's own satellite? What about a close flyby of a satellite? What are the red lines here? How do we deal with all these issues? So, and the draft could also be interpreted as not prohibiting testing against one's own outer space objects, so employing ground, sea, or air-based weapons, enabling a repeat of the Chinese 2007 ASAT test or the recent India's test. And importantly, that proposal does not include integral and legally binding verification regime for effectively monitoring compliance, which was indicated by the two countries that would be proposed later as the negotiations go forward. So besides the joint efforts on Paris and PPWT, Russia also pledged in the UN General Assembly First Committee in October 2004 that it will not be the first to place weapons of any kind in outer space. In 2014, Russia proposed such an approach at the UNGA First Committee in a resolution, which was named the same way, no first placement of weapons in outer space. And this initiative is also aimed at supporting the draft PPWT. I think that major issue with this initiative is, for example, if a country declares not to be first to place a weapon, well, what does it prevent not to be the second? So would that mean that the country stops researching, developing, and testing such capabilities? I would suspect the answer is no. So if, to sum it up, I think that the no first placement, quote unquote, and the Paris and the PPWT initiatives, I think, they're pursued while both countries are, developing, counter space capabilities. And so it would appear that the political doctrine of those countries is defensive, but I think the military strategy is offensive. So that creates, I think, a problem for how we deal with this issue down the road. But I think it is important that a lot of UN countries, they do reflectively sign up onto these arms control proposals because they do sound like a very, very good idea, I think, first when you look at them. So again, I think this whole, why have I started with the Russia-China proposals? The reason why I mentioned these first is because the United States and Europe, are challenged by this because we are trying to promote, we're not trying to look at banning technologies, but we're rather trying to look how do we limit harmful or irresponsible behavior. So, these are actually very, different approaches, and I think that, we kind of need to understand how this challenges the discussion. So I think there was a good news recently in the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, where in June 2019, this is this year, the countries adopted guidelines for the long-term sustainable outer space activities. The countries agreed on 21 guidelines, which are supposed to help the countries on their national level to strengthen some of the norms of responsible behavior. And that means, of course, that this was agreed unanimously by all countries that includes those three actors. And there's also a report that was put out by consensus. There was a group of 15 experts on so-called space transparency and confidence building measures. And this group of governmental experts was put together, and in 2013, they released a report on space TCBMs, which was a consensus report. So these are all very positive things, and they also show that China, Russia, and the United States can actually agree on some bottom line, positive momentum. The question is that, the implementation is a question because these are only politically binding, however non-legally binding initiatives. So we have to see how can we create a momentum to move forward these initiatives. So I think that what seems to me, and I'm happy to be challenged by you from the audience, is that the existing space reality, I think, makes it virtually impossible to employ any kind of traditional arms control approaches, because it's how the technologies are used rather than technologies themselves that need to be addressed. But again, if you have any other thoughts on this, I would be happy to talk about that. So, and again, if we go then to TCBMs, these are wonderful instruments, but they're always influenced by the broader geopolitical developments as well as technological modernization. So, but at least they're a beacon of kind of willingness to comply with the norms, and I think that's a good thing. So, what are the key challenges? I think the bottom line is that most space capabilities, even the commercial and the civilian, are of dual-use nature, and they can have counter space applications. So I think that needs to be understood when we create our policy and tools, as well as practical steps how we get there. And we need effective, that's Moriba's business, we need to somehow create effective screening mechanisms for detecting the first signs of problems, I think, in a very early stage. And I think we're not really there. And again, ambiguous attribution in terms of hostile actions and activities, that is a very relevant question. And this is something that I think we have been dealing with. And from the economic and financial perspective, I think the longer term issue of competing models of space partnerships could prove to be problematic. I think in terms of how do we guard ourselves against falling into some kind of spiral model of the security dilemma here. And again, we need to understand better I think the deterrence dynamic here. What stakes do we have to accompany the carrots that we have been putting forward? And I think that we do not have a lot of options. So I think to conclude, I think that we are witnessing an environment of pretty big tensions between the major space powers, and we really need to focus more than ever before how to diminish the destabilizing aspects of military competition in space. I think that's pretty clear. And I think that we have to employ all the tools that would promote confidence among the space actors, but I think that accompanying that has to be some kind of bottom line understanding of what is definitely not acceptable in the space domain. And I think that, regrettably, I think we do not have that kind of understanding. So we definitely should be guided by the UN consensus in terms of the treaties and the principles that we have on space, but we also have to support it by understanding better how to address the change space paradigm that we're dealing with today. So, and how do we address that? Well, we need political leadership, because without political leadership, we cannot move forward, and we're going to be stuck in an endless spiral of discussions that go past each other. We also have to understand something that is happening, and that's the more complex traffic in space. And how do we deal with that? The United States is promoting a concept of better space traffic coordination. What does that mean exactly? I think is not yet precisely clear. The Europeans are only at the beginning of those discussions, but of course, other countries are also interested in moving forward in participating in these discussions. But again, they're waiting for some kind of leadership, I think, on the part of the major countries. in terms of economic and financial domain, I think we definitely need to emphasize market principles, and that means disclosure, transparency, proper risk management, good governance, and the rule of law to help mitigate, I think, risks to the independence and well-being of recipient countries seeking to benefit from potentially unsustainable deals. So I think with this, I will conclude my presentation and we can now move forward with the discussion. Please.
A lot of the satellite capabilities for communication, and of course most communication happens not through satellite but through fiber optic cable. After 2011, a lot of the countries you bring out suddenly realized that all of their communication flowed through the US and other countries that were looking at everything they said, and therefore this sort of alternative path became attractive.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the economic single source supply that you describe work in a world in which most communication is actually going another path?
Mm-hmm. So I think that when you look at what do countries acquire? A lot of countries, there are only few countries that can afford a comprehensive satellite capabilities that range from satellite communications to Earth observation to position navigation timing, or if you include space situational awareness. Only a few countries can afford that because space is still very expensive. So when some of these smaller countries want to enter or become a spacefaring nation, they usually acquire first something that is very important to them, and that is what you mentioned, telecommunications, or they also now increasingly acquire some Earth observation capabilities. Fiber optic cables don't work everywhere. They don't always work where you need them, and they don't always work when you need them, for example, for national security purposes. So when I'm saying that the countries are acquiring it, they are acquiring because they want to strengthen, for example, either access of their citizens to better of these communications, so the socioeconomic aspect, and then you've got, of course, also the national security aspect. So I think that these countries always want to think about who do they acquire it for, and what kind of supply chain and other vulnerabilities that there are. But I don't think that smaller countries that don't always have the capacity and capability to think through all the steps. Really, I think first thing, I get the capabilities, I worry about the rest later. And I think that this could create some of the vulnerabilities to these countries that they're not potentially quite familiar with today, or